Very special word of welcome to everybody at all of our campuses. So glad to be with you. Clemens, King, Kernersville, and to everyone who is joining us online. Are you ready for some good news? He alone is worthy. We saw last week he's the man of heaven, the only one worthy of our worship. And today we say he alone is worthy because he is the bread of heaven. If you've ever been really hungry, you know what it feels like. Like, I have to have food. Spiritually, for your spiritual life, for your soul, for your life of your personhood, that's the way that you, whether you know it or not, crave for the gift of grace that's in Jesus Christ. We're going to learn about the bread of heaven. When our little girl Abby was, maybe 4, she was saying the blessing at dinner time at table. And she loves the Lord today, and she did when she was a little girl. And she was having the prayer, and she just prayed her heart out. And then at the end, she just couldn't help herself but overflow with praise. And here's the way it came out at the end. She said, "And Lord, you're the best God I've ever had." And there's a whole lot of theological depth to that, because we actually are in a world that is filled with many would-be gods, that which would claim to be able to feed us, to provide for us, to satisfy us. And today we see that he alone is worthy because Jesus is the only real answer to our deepest hunger. The stories are, these stories in which our texts are set are both stories of hunger. The first, a story of people who've come out of their slavery, out of Egypt, and then they go into a wilderness and they're hungry. And they begin to grumble and they want food. The second story, the story in which we learn Jesus is the bread of heaven, follows a time in which a large crowd had gathered around the Sea of Galilee because they wanted to see this prophetic miracle working man and hear his teaching and watch and experience his ministry. And the day went long, and so the people were beginning to get hungry, and that's when they brought forth a child who had some fish and some loaves, and they began giving them out, and it was the miracle that fed over 5,000 people. So context of two stories about hunger is where we begin. You know, hunger's an odd thing. We don't ever stop to think very philosophically about hunger, but I have this week. Most of the time we're hungry, we just want to get some food. But I've been thinking about how hunger, it's an odd thing because it sort of hurts, when you're hungry, right? Something hurts, but it's not like other kinds of hurt. It's an entirely different way. It's not like a bruised muscle or a cut or a headache. Hunger, but it hurts. There's something that's like you can't really rest if you know you're really hungry. You've got to be thinking about food. So it's a kind of hurt, but it's a hurt that is satisfied only by food. So think about it. It's just odd. It's odd. God made us this way. And if we're hungry, we don't function as well. Some of us can get a little irritable if they miss some meals. And our son Bennett, growing up, he was the most even-tempered and calm. But I remember him, especially as a teenager, if he couldn't get his food, it just throw his whole body out of kilter. And so, we've come up with a word in our culture when we're hungry and angry, we're hangry. And some of you can identify with that. So hunger is an odd thing. And it is something that is nonetheless, though it is a pain when we feel hunger, and it affects everything in our being, it is an essential, right? It is a God-given gift. Remember, he put Adam and Eve in the garden and told them to eat of any tree that they wanted. So hunger is not something that came in after sin. It was in paradise, right? God made us to be hungry so that we would want food. And if we're not hungry, something is wrong. I remember when Bennett was little, the first time we had to take him to the doctor, and he quit eating and he was irritable. And so we were really worried about it as new parents, and went in, and the pediatrician that we took him to, we happened to be visiting Winston-Salem where Ann grew up, and was her same pediatrician, got to see our little boy, and he was an old, wise pediatrician, and we were nervous, and he said, oh, he's got 2 bad ear infections. And we said, but doctor, he won't eat. He said, oh, we'll clear up these ear infections. As soon as he does, he's going to want to eat everything. And sure enough, it was. So if we're not hungry, something's wrong. And so health and hunger go together, right? And when we're sick, there's something in us that loses our normal sense of hunger. But this hunger that God gave us, it doesn't serve a random craving, right? It's something that is essential. Have you ever stopped to think about that? God made you, I'm just drawing an analogy from the physical hunger, because we're going to be talking about spiritual hunger and the satisfaction of our souls. But he made us so that we just have to have, because it hurts, everything within us hurts in some unique way if we don't have food, that we want to think about food and we need to get the food. Because the food is essential to our life. If we don't get it, we die. So isn't that something? That we actually are designed to hunger for what not just we want, but what we need. We need the food. And it's interesting also to me, I'm just being philosophical about hunger. It's interesting to me that we also were given taste buds so that not only do we hurt and crave for the food that is essential, that we must have lest we die, but that God made it so that we could enjoy partaking of it through the savor of its tastes. So, isn't that interesting? And one more observation that we can all identify with. The thing that's interesting about hunger is that no matter how much you eat, you will get hungry again. How many of us, maybe you said it at Thanksgiving meal, you eat, you overeat, you're so stuffed, and you go, I've said it to me, I'm not going to eat food for a week. And at that moment, you think, I will never be hungry again. And then, about 5 or 6 hours later, here it comes again. You're like, wait a minute, what was I saying? No, here I am again. So this continual hunger means we must continually have food. We enjoy the food. Food is on our minds. So hunger shapes the rhythm of our lives. Now pivot in your thinking, because what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount relates to this spiritually. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. So all of this is to say that in the same way that hunger physically is a sign of health and a gift that moves you towards what you need, and you need on an ongoing basis, in the same way, Jesus says, there is a way that we hunger spiritually. We hunger not physically, but for what our soul needs, and that when you have that hunger, you are blessed, because it's what leads to infilling. So that's a little philosophical reflection about hunger, and I hope that it's not making you hungry. So now to our 2 contexts that are underneath these important texts. The first, this story of the manna. So the people of God were slaves in Egypt, and they were oppressed horribly by a tyrant. So don't forget, they were slaves. They were beaten. They were oppressed. They were living on the bare minimum. They had no ownership. They had no future. They're slaves. And God, by the blood of a lamb, the Passover lamb over their doorpost, proves himself mighty and delivers the people out of their bondage from Egypt and into freedom. And that freedom is glorious, and they dance and they sing on the other side of the Red Sea. But then after a long weekend, they're already beginning to get a little hungry. And when they are led out into the wilderness way, we read in Exodus 16:2, the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you've brought us out into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." So they are hungry and they're angry, they're hangry. They have, as if they have forgotten all the oppression and bitterness of their slavery. All they could remember is that they didn't have to think about food because the slave masters gave them food. And I want you to note that well, because there's a powerful spiritual image in this. The slave owner gave the slaves food not because of love, not to be a gift, and not even because he cared about their hunger, but the slave owner gave the slaves food so he could use them. Which goes far to explain the spiritual battle that we're in, and 1,000 would-be gods that want to give you the promise of food, speaking metaphorically, not to bless you, but to use you. That's what every demon in hell wants to do. And in Exodus 16:4, you see that the Lord says to Moses, "Behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you." And it starts with this, that God is the giver. And wow, the people were grumbling, and God gave despite their horrible attitude. They'd lost their gratitude for their deliverance from slavery. They'd lost their faith, and they were letting just their physical hunger dictate everything that they thought, and God loved them anyway, and God fed them anyway. So, wow, He's the giver of all good gifts. And this is important, that we'll see in a moment, because the people had in mind that maybe Moses was the one who was the giver. John 6:32, Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven." All right, back to Exodus 16:4. In this verse again, you learn that the bread is from heaven, and that's the phrase Jesus then applies to himself, bread from heaven. And also in that verse, we read this, that the people are told they shall go out and gather a day's portion every day. There we are. That's the nature of hunger. It's daily. It's continual. And we learn in verse 4, he says, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. So I won't take much time to talk about what the Bible means when we talk about testing or what God means by this. But it's not like God is a drill sergeant in heaven who is putting you through the rigor, so that he could see you fail or yell at you. I was thinking back of my nephew, Chris, who years ago did basic training. Said it's the hardest 10 weeks he ever had in his life down at Fort Jackson. And there was a guy in his basic training that just was struggling with feeling like he wouldn't get enough food, so he was sneaking some food out of the mess hall. And this was a big no. I mean, he got caught a couple times, like with some snack bars under his bunk, and drill sergeant had nothing to do with it. Just always on this guy, Private Jones. His name, Private Jones. and he'd be yelling like this. And he said they got near the last day of training, and they were doing what I can't remember what you call that, crawl maneuver, and the drill sergeant's hollering at him, and all of a sudden, one of those snack bars fell out of Private Jones' pocket, and it was, "Private Jones, what are you doing?" And some people think God's like that. You say, "Oh, he's testing us," He's like this drill sergeant. Now, this very much means something different than that. It means the Lord is giving a teaching exercise with the opportunity to learn and demonstrate growth in trust of God. That's what he's saying here. It means that when God's talking about a test, he's talking about something that is fundamental to your well-being, that you really got to get this. So this is one of those instances, like whatever spiritual lesson we're learning from the manna, he's like, you got to get this. Okay. Exodus 16:15, still talking about the manna. This flaky substance starts appearing on the ground that God had promised would be there. And when the people of Israel, verse 15, saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" And this is almost funny, because what is it actually in Hebrew is manna or manhu. And so manna means, what is it? I always love that. It's like they didn't know what to call it. They didn't know what, never seen anything like it. It's just a provision from heaven of something you eat that just shows up for them. And so they just called it, what is it? And it doesn't look like maybe something that would nourish them, but it is. And, sometimes God's grace is like that, isn't it? It's like, what is this? Oh, it's the provision of God. So that's what manna is. And still at verse 15, they said, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It's the bread the Lord has given you to eat." So there it is again, a gift. So what are we learning? It's given by God. It's given by God. It's a gift from God. It's grace. It's prefiguring grace. And notice the instructions, verse 16 of Exodus 16. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it. So it's a gift, but it must be appropriated. It must be taken in. It doesn't just drop in your mouth. Gather of it, each one of you. This is each person. You don't get to have someone else gather your manna for you. You don't get to borrow someone else's manna. You don't get to, everybody needs the grace. Everybody must gather. And with verse 16, as much as he can eat, you shall take each an omer according to the number of the persons each of you has in his tent. So, same provision, same gift, same grace. People are appropriating different amounts as matches them. So God's gifts are sufficient for you. And what that looks like in terms of the giftedness and the grace that comes into each of our lives, it may be different, but in proportion. But it's the same grace. It's the same gift. Verse 17 and 18, the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. No one went without as long as they were relying on the manna. It was just what they need. Manna matches the need. My grace is sufficient for you. And sometimes, of course, people tried to hoard it. God had said, you can't do that. He said, verse 19, let no one leave any of it over till morning. But they did not listen to Moses, and some left part of it till morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. So if you tried to take the manna, get a big pile of it and say, tomorrow I won't gather, I'm going to rely on today's grace for tomorrow also, then it just rotted and it got worms, and it was like it was worse than if you hadn't gathered it in the first place. I had a friend who had adopted a child, and as is the case with often the case, and kids have been adopted, if they've been in a place where they had to share all their toys and didn't have their own stuff, it's really hard for them not to hoard or hide their own toys if they get hold of them. And this little boy loved playing with little toy cars. And so the dad said these cars kept disappearing, like where are they? Until finally he found they were all tucked way under the mattress in the little boy's bed. Because the way we think as orphans is, I don't have any guarantee there'll be something tomorrow, right? And what God's trying to demonstrate through the manna is it is going to be there tomorrow also. So you don't have to be a hoarder of grace. You just live on it like food that comes every day. And it's tempting. We want to try to have a life with God that we get a lot of grace today and then we don't need God for the next period of time. We'd like to change the prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. And we like to say, give me enough bread now that I don't have to even think about it for another year, And that's not the way God does. Wasn't His design. The hunger comes. The moral of that story is trying to live on yesterday's grace just stinks. It doesn't work. God gives grace for today. And that's why sometimes when we get lost in worry, Ann and I always remind each other, God doesn't give grace for hypothetical situations. But boy, He does give you grace for what you need. So we need God like we need food. We need Him every day. We need Him all the time. It never stops. And God is like that manna who is gracious to us on a daily basis. And the provision, as you see in the story, is that it's always from heaven and it's a gift. So God's the provider, it's His gift, and we appropriate it, and He builds our faith the more that we learn to rely on that manna. Sometimes provision comes along in just ways that just is so supernatural and so delightful that you just know, wow. And He'll just build your faith like that. And manna was sort of like that. It's just a miracle from heaven that was designed to build faith. Our friends, Ron and Sandra Block, tell a story. I think maybe I told some years ago. I was thinking of it when I was thinking about the manna. Ron, one of the best guitarists in the world, and Sandra, wonderful, delightful woman of God, have 2 children, and Erica, their daughter, always wanted to have some chickens. Her mother had said, no, we're not going to have chickens. They live outside of Nashville in a kind of more rural area, so they had some horses, and but she said, no, the chickens. Well, long part of the story that makes short is that they were able to get some wonderful new hardwood to put down as floors in their house that had come from another building being torn down. So they put the floor in. But in order to put the floor in, it required boxing up all of their stuff. And I know what that's like. We just had a flood in our downstairs. We had to box up everything and take it out of the house, and you're in a hurry and you box it up. And you don't even remember what you boxed up half the time. Sometimes you put it up in the attic or somewhere else and you forget it. Well, they had done all this. And years later, after this new floor, their beloved dog died. It was very sad. And Erica, now a little older, says, could we get chickens now that the dog has died? Well, feeling bad about the dog's death, and Sandra, the mom, she just had a change of heart. She and Ron, she said, all right, we'll get the chickens. So they get some baby chicks. All right. Now, their son, Ethan, is getting ready to graduate from high school, and the parents want to bless him with a really big graduation party, so that's going to be expensive. And a second expense on top of that suddenly emerges that they weren't expecting, and that is that Sandra's sister called and said, we and our 5 kids, we want to come and visit you. They lived in Canada. We're going to come visit you this summer, and we'll stay for a couple weeks. Sandra was so excited to have her sister come, but knew that that's an investment, that's an expense. You're going to host people for a couple weeks like that in your home and all these things. And then a third financial need came up right on top of it. A dear friend, I'll call her Bessie, approached Sandra and said that she had a financial need. And without hesitation, Sandra's like, of course, we will help you. but just all of a sudden, three things that were on top of one another of financial needs. The graduation for Ethan, and Sandra's sister is coming, and then Bessie has some financial needs. So that's going on, and she's got all this on her mind about the financial expenses. Well, chickens grow kind of fast, and Erica didn't have any place for them, and so they're trying to get them out of a little box into some bigger container, and Sandra goes in and sees in the corner of one of the rooms a bin that you lose sight of it, you forget you even had it, that was one of the things that got packed up when they had replaced the floors. She says, that big bin that we packed up years ago would be a good next place for these chickens as they're growing so fast. So she goes over and opens the bin. And she starts down memory lane, just, years since she had even looked at this stuff that had been gone down in this bin, no idea what was in there. You've got something in your attic, you don't even know what's in there. She empties the bin, going through things, and then at the bottom, there's a wooden box. And on the top of that wood, now remember, I want you to keep in mind these three financial needs that had come up. Ethan's graduation, Sandra's sister's coming with visit this summer, and Bessie needed some money. And she digs down to the bottom of this box, this bin, and finds a little wooden box. And on the top of the box, there was a picture of Ethan when he was a baby. And so she went down memory lane talking about what a blessing. And now here he is getting ready to graduate, Ethan. And underneath Ethan's picture was a piece of cardboard that had pinned into it curling pins. The sport curling, the Olympic sport where you're on the ice and you're getting the little discs down the... Well, Sandra's sister was on the Canadian national curling team and had a lot of awards. And for some reason, Sandra had these pins, that's like medals, and they were such a reminder of her sister who was getting ready to come for a visit. And she lifted up the cardboard that was in this little box, and underneath the cardboard that had this was a picture of Bessie. And it reminded her to pray for Bessie. And so Ethan's whose graduation is coming, and the sister who's going to come for a big visit, and Bessie, and all these unexpected financial needs. And she opened this bin and this box, and there they were from years before. She went through that, and she pulled up the picture of Bessie, and underneath it was $4,000 in cash. It was enough money to get a great graduation party, to help really host her family wonderful when they came, and to help out Bessie with her need and have a little bit left over. And Sandra said she had a very, very faint memory of maybe one time Ron had gone out on one of his music gigs and gotten paid in cash, and they said, well, maybe you could have some cash sometime, and stuffed it somewhere, but she just totally forgotten it. Sometimes God rains down something miraculous, not just because He loves you, not just because He knows you need the provision, but because He is showing you His grace. He's teaching it to you. This is one more Old Testament text before we look at Jesus, the bread of heaven, how He fulfills all this. Deuteronomy 8:3. He humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So the manna wasn't just about the provision, the manna was about the promise. And the promise is more precious than the provision. Because if you're hungry, you might think all you need is just one good meal. That's not what you need. You need food on an ongoing basis. You need a provider, not just a provision. And God was teaching something essential to the people. To say that a man does not live by bread alone, but by the Word of God, is to say that we live now and for eternity, substantially, essentially, by the very promises that have issued forth from the mouth of God. They are like food to us. They are like the substance of eternity. They are life to us. That's what manna was. So in the end, it was a huge shift from relying on slave masters to give you food so they could use you, to being liberated by the blood of the Lamb, and now relying on God to give you food because He loves you and has a plan for your life. The man was teaching all of that and more. Now we come to Galilee in the first century. Huge crowd gathered. People had seen His miracles and people are getting hungry. They bring forth a little boy. He's got some fishes and loaves that Jesus says, we start giving it out and it never runs out. The miracle of the loaves and fishes. The next day, Jesus is on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and people come and get in boats and come find Him. And they made all this effort to get to Jesus, and they start inquiring of Him. And He said to them in John 6:26, truly, truly, I say to you, you're seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. You worked hard to get to the other side of the sea, He's saying, but He's turning it to a spiritual conversation. And they said to Him, verse 28, well, what must we do to be doing the works of God? Because they wanted to reduce it down to some legalism, a few things on a list of things to do. And Jesus says at verse 29, this is the work of God, that you believe in Him. You believe in Him whom He sent. There had arisen a common belief, an expectation around the first century that the Messiah would recreate the miracle of the manna. One of the midrash, one of the Jewish rabbinical teachings that came sometime after the first century reflects this, in which in this one writing it says, as the first Redeemer was, so, speaking of Moses, so shall the latter Redeemer be. As the former Redeemer caused manna to descend, behold, as it is stated, I will cause rain bread from heaven for you, so will the latter Redeemer cause manna to descend. So there was an expectation that it would be a Moses-like miracle with a white flaky substance. But John 6:32, Jesus reinterprets all this and says, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is He who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. So He takes one of the best known, best loved stories in all of Old Testament faith and all of Hebrew narratives, and He says, this was all about me. The bread of God is here. And He said to him at verse 34, sir, give us this bread always. And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall never thirst. At first they grumbled. They said, isn't this just Joseph's son, the carpenter's boy? But Jesus becomes explicit at verse 47. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. I'm the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he'll live forever. So last time we saw Jesus is the better, the truer, the perfect Adam. This week we see He is the truer, the better, the perfect manna. He is the one who is the gift, the grace of God. So God, in the Old Testament picture, put the people into a wilderness where they would physically hunger, so they would need bread from heaven so that they could learn that they do not live by bread alone, but by the promises of God. And He wanted them to shift from being fed by slave masters, imposters who pretend like they want to nourish you, to being fed by God Himself as a completely free gift, and to discover that grace is daily. It can't be hoarded, it can't be substituted, it can't be borrowed. It's a gift, but it is appropriated. It is gathered just like manna. There is a spiritual hunger inside of every person. And if you don't know Him yet, You're hungering for Him. You were made for God every bit as much as your body was made for physical food. You're made for God. You'll never be satisfied by any other God except Jesus Christ, the Lord of all, who is the bread of heaven. He said, the bread is my body. What he's saying is that I came to die in your place and take your sin into my being and be crucified on a cross, which would pay the debt of your sin in full, so that anyone who believes, that's the work of God, just trusting, believing, would not perish but have everlasting life. They had to learn to trust the manna was going to be there every day, because God was painting a picture of what He wants for you and me this Christmas season and always. And that is to remember that that little baby that was born in a town that was called Bethlehem, which means house of bread, and was put into a feeding trough, that little boy is the Messiah, the God-man, who is the bread of heaven, the true manna, the bread of life. He's everything you need, and He'll always be what you need, and He'll always be there by His grace. He's the bread of heaven, and that's the gospel.